Like everywhere else in the world, Britons are increasingly fatigued and tired with the restrictions, but also with the reality of COVID-19. Until yesterday, the UK was divided into geographical regions according to three tiers or levels of restrictions, with Tier 1 being the least restrictive and Tier 3 the most. But at 4 p.m. yesterday, as you saw there, Prime Minister Boris Johnson introduced a new fourth tier, even tighter restrictions for people in areas where a newly identified variant of the virus has been identified as spreading rapidly. And these new tighter restrictions would be imposed, he said, within 8 hours. So they're already in place this morning. So as of 1 minute past midnight, all all Tier 3 areas across London and southeast England moved into Tier 4 restrictions, as making their headlines of the newspapers today. Around 18 million people are now in these Tier 4 areas. And those new Tier 4 category rules are somewhat like the November lockdown rules that the whole country experienced back then. People are asked to stay home, only to go into work if they can't work at home. No household mixing, no non-essential travel is allowed. Social mixing is now restricted to meeting only one other person and outdoors in a public place. Non-essential shops, gyms, hairdressers, cinemas will all remain closed for 2 weeks. No overnight stays are allowed. Religious services will be permitted, so a little different from some of the previous lockdowns, but even weddings, civil partnership ceremonies are now not allowed at all. And the Netherlands has announced that it won't allow any flights from Britain to land in the country to try and stop that new strain of coronavirus spreading there, where they've currently identified one case.
Certainly dramatic steps here. Any changes? I'm not sure where the statistics stand right now in the UK in terms of who's already been vaccinated, but are you aware of anything that's been announced in terms of how this may alter the national vaccine plans based on the mutated strain?
Well, this new strain is interesting because Britain has identified it predominantly in the southeast of the country, and particularly in London and around Kent. So that's why there are these tighter restrictions in those areas, which do also limit movement from those areas into other areas. It hasn't stopped the vaccination program. In fact, the government scientists have said that they don't see any evidence, certainly at this stage, that the vaccine will be less effective on this new strain. What's interesting about the new strain is that in places like London, it now accounts for the majority of new infections. And that means, they say, that it's spreading more easily. It's something that spreads faster and better than the previous coronavirus. Currently, though, they say there's no evidence that it makes you more ill, and there's no evidence that it results in more deaths than the old strain. So there may be less to worry about in that respect, but certainly the increased rate of spreading of the virus is something to be alarmed about, and that's why they're putting in place these tighter restrictions. Because Britain was the first in the world to start with the authorization of the vaccine and to start giving it, they believe, I think, that some people were beginning to let down their guard. And this new strain of the virus perhaps is a reminder that it's far too early to do that, especially when vaccinating a country the size of the United Kingdom is not an easy task, especially with limitations on the amount of vaccine that's available, very complex limitations on how the vaccine can be given. We all know about the super deep freeze it needs to be kept in, the supply chain, getting access to all the people who are allowed to have the vaccine and then those who want to have it later down the line. So certainly with these new restrictions in place, Tier 4 restrictions here in London and elsewhere in the country, and 18 million under these tight rules, the end of the tunnel is not that close.
Now, what would certainly have been the top story there outside of pandemic times, Brexit seemingly breaking down or at least stalling in terms of reaching agreements on trade. Now, has that story been relegated to the back pages to some degree, given the outbreak now, or is there a mixing of these two really big issues for the country?
Well, Boris Johnson, when he came into power around a year ago, certainly could never have foreseen the year that he's been in charge of in the UK. His entire election campaign was based around getting Brexit done. And as you say, that has really fallen down the news agenda. And in most people's lives, it's still a big concern, but it's not the main concern. Now there's this international pandemic involving deaths and health around the world, freedom of travel, freedom of movement, even within one's own city and country. So what's happening with Brexit? Those negotiations dragging on, still apparently a stalemate between both sides, the European Union and the UK, over a trade agreement. Britain certainly posturing that it's willing to walk away, and Boris Johnson saying that he would prefer no deal to a bad deal. Certain issues still proving to be sticking points, but the optimists can point to the fact that both sides do keep saying there is still point in carrying on the discussions, and there is still the desire to reach a deal, even though perhaps it seems unlikely.
Well, certainly pressing issues. So you detailed to us the headlines focused on the immediate here. Now, thanks very much, Jonathan Sacerdoti.